The Residential Infill Working Group is hosting this infill and zoning session to inform residents in redeveloping areas and communities within those areas about some of the recommendations we are making regarding the RS small scale residential zone and landscaping regulations. And we hope that this can be used as a tool to help you prepare for the upcoming June 3rd zoning bylaw review, 1 year zoning bylaw review at Urban Planning Committee. So how did we get here? The evolution of Edmonton's planning processes has been incremental. So this is an overview of the significant city planning processes. Initially, there were two roadmaps, the 2014 and the 2018 infill roadmaps. And together, they introduced almost 50 actions that have been completed to incentivize infill redevelopment in the city. One of the key changes that happened at the end of 2018, when the single detached, previous RF1 single detached zone in the earlier zoning bylaw was amended, 2 additional residential uses were added. So you could now build on a single detached lot, any single detached lot in the city, semi-detached side-by-side housing, which is shown at the top there, or duplex housing, which is up and down. So duplex housing has a second floor dwelling. Each principal dwelling could have both a secondary suite and a garden suite. So that allowed between 3 and 6 dwellings, depending on the size of the lot. And this ended exclusive single detached zoning in 2018. So that has not existed in Edmonton since then. In 2020, they also approved open option parking, which allowed property owners, businesses, developers to decide how much parking to provide on a site. The city plan, Edmonton City Plan, was approved in 2020. It's the vision of the city to grow to a city of 2 million. The focus is on growth, and the focus is on being a rebuildable city. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. In 2021, 78 communities received a 21-day notice that their statutory area redevelopment plans or community development plans or neighborhood development plans were going to be repealed. And it was quite surprising because they had spent 2 to 3 years developing these plans with the city, with engaging with the city. And so there was essentially further guidance was going to be provided by the city plan until the city caught up and provided a new zoning bylaw and district planning. Also in 2021, in the spring of 2021, was a report released called the Zoning Bylaw Through the Lens of Equity. It explains really what changed regarding community engagement and the definition of community. In the past, community was defined as a neighborhood in which people live and they share the amenities and they sort of are members of that community or residents of that community, is sort of that identity. But in the zoning bylaw through the lens of equity and in the city's GBA plus equity toolkit, that was sort of changed. So now community, the city was engaging with an equity seeking group or a special interest group. And that is the other definition of community. It's unfortunately that the engagement specifically with residents in geographic communities was kind of lost. The zoning bylaw was approved in 2023 and it came into effect in January of 2024. So it's been in effect for 18 months. And in that time, the city has received 97% of their development application target that was a target set for the end of 2026. So they're way ahead of schedule. They had about 50% of their development applications approved by the beginning of this year. So, you know, there's a lot of infill in the hopper, so to speak. And in 2024, fall of 2024, they approved new district policy and district plans. There's 15 of them. And so they provide guidance to how the zoning bylaw or where zones are in the city and where density is to be focused. So the city plan approved in 2020 focuses on a rebuildable city, and it is the primary focus of the zoning bylaw and district plan. Where is infill being built? Well, it's no longer being built in the core part of the city or in these mature neighborhoods. It's now being built within the Anthony Henday in an area called the Redeveloping Area. And the intention is to bring 600,000 additional residents to this redeveloping area and add 50% of new net dwelling units as infill. So the zoning bylaw 20001 has been in effect since January of 2024, and it introduces two things. The first thing is simplified regulation. So what the city has done is they have combined the previous zones of the earlier zoning bylaw, RF1, RF2, RF3, and RF4. So all of these zones have been combined to create the RS small-scale residential zone. The other thing the zoning bylaw did was it provided development flexibility. Essentially, it created a development box within which, the developer has flexibility for how dwellings within the box can be arranged. And essentially, anything goes within this box. There are some setback considerations and separation between buildings, etc. But really, it really significantly increased and relaxed the rules within this box. So I want to encourage, before we get started, I just want to talk a little bit about engagement with the city. It's really important to think about how can you encourage positive change as your neighborhood grows and as infill redevelopment is built. And how can we avoid polarizing conversations? It's important to understand the interests of all the stakeholders involved, because it allows you to have a bit better opportunity to advocate for what you want. And one of the things that I am a little bit concerned about is the term character and how infill is impacting the character of neighborhoods. It's a subjective term. It is hard to define. It's hard to agree on. What one person thinks is character is other people are able to accept something that's new. So I think compatibility is a term that might be better focused on. Compatibility, it's a term that's referred to in land use and urban planning, and I think looking at how infill redevelopment or zones are compatible with other zones and different uses within that zone. Impacts versus aesthetics. It's easy to say, I don't like the look of something, but everyone has a different, they value aesthetics differently, or what one person might really like something that's traditional, and the other person might say, well, I really like this contemporary design. So again, it's a subjective term, and it's a subjective thing. Impacts, though, are something that the city's supposed to consider. They are supposed to, in their planning processes, have consideration for the long-term cumulative impacts to things like the environment, social impacts, health impacts, and economic impacts of all of the stakeholders' interests. So it's important to understand, what don't you like, and also why don't you like it? What changes are needed? What can you recommend for changes that would improve future infill redevelopment? And what infill can you accept on your next door to you, on your block, in your neighborhood, and where should it go? So another thing I'm going to be referring to are two distinct development patterns. A development pattern is the way buildings, roadways, different things are organized in the landscape. And it is, there are underlying rules and practices, so in policies, so we have underlying zoning regulations, underlying district policy now that govern that arrangement. The first is the traditional development pattern of many central and mature neighborhoods. And what that looks like is you've got all of these Principal dwellings are main residential buildings that are aligned along the street. They're lined along 62nd Avenue here in Park Allen. And then behind them, you have rear buildings that are more or less aligned. Some are closer to the lane than others, but they're more or less aligned. And within, there is green space. And then there's the suburban development pattern. This began to be built in the 60s, 70s. And what that looked like was all of the site coverage in a single building with an attached front garage and a driveway that was accessed from the street. And so that is a completely different development pattern than the traditional development pattern where you have front and rear buildings aligned along a street or a lane. So now we're going to look at the small scale residential zone, the RS zone. The first section is that 1.0 purpose of the zone. And the purpose of this zone is to allow for a range of small-scale residential development, 1 to 3 stories, which is low-rise, that means low-rise in height, including detached, attached, and, it's been added, multi-unit residential housing mid-block. So if you look at this illustration here, you're going to see most of these are the original development. There's an original mature development here. This looks like it's kind of the new infill. But in the new zoning bylaw, they're not only going to allow multi-unit development on the corner of the block, they're going to allow it mid-block. So that's what this is. And this is a change, a significant change. This previous zoning bylaw allowed triplexes on corner sites, but the new zoning bylaw allows fourplexes and secondary suites mid-block. So the RS zone essentially combines incompatible development patterns in mature neighborhoods. It introduces large buildings where all the site coverage is applied to that one building, and it allows that multi-unit building to be inserted mid-block amongst a traditional development pattern. It puts a square peg into a round hole. Now, communities and residents who raise concerns about loss of character have been stereotyped as NIMBY or afraid of change. But really, many support increasing density. What they're opposed to, instinctively, is the combining of incompatible development patterns. So this next section is the residential uses section, and there are a lot more uses, residential uses. So this is the diversity of housing the city's been talking about. They want to increase the diversity of housing types. And it allows duplex housing, semi-detached housing, single attached housing. It allows lodging, so you can have a house which has a whole bunch of bedrooms that are locked, and you have shared space and a kitchen space. And it allows supportive housing. So, but the key thing that it allows is this mid-block row housing, or small apartments being built mid-block. It has introduced cluster housing. This is cluster housing. It's kind of an L-shaped development. This is on 109th Street. And essentially this is on 2 consolidated lots. They built 3 semi-detached homes with 4 units in each, so for a total of 12 units. This mid-block row housing allows 4 principal dwellings with 4 secondary suites, so up to the maximum of 8. In the small apartment, you've got, I think, 6, looks like about 6. This is in Grandview. This is in Park Allen. I think this is really attractive. It's semi-detached with 2 principal dwellings, and there's 2 secondary dwellings that you don't see the entrances to, because I've kind of trimmed that off. And then there's like tiny homes are possible, a single detached, you can subdivide a lot. So there's lots of opportunities to build a variety of housing. So the other thing in section 2 uses are additional commercial uses. So you can have, you might be crafty, and you might be creating something that you sell from your home. You have a small business that you sell from your home. You could have a child care service. You could have a bakery in the back in your garage, or some other kind of manufacturing thing that you're doing in your garage. So there's a number of different new uses. Section 3, additional uses, is where they've increased the number of dwellings to increase the amount of density that can be added. So as I said earlier, in the earlier zoning bylaw, you could have up to 6 dwellings on a site in a previous RF1 or RF3 zone. But now you can have up to 8 on an interior site, so mid-block. So now we're going to look at the site and building regulations. Really, this is the rules for where the building can go on the site and how it can be arranged. First of all, the first regulation is Regulation 4.1.1, and it introduces minimum site area per dwelling of 75 square meters. So what does that mean? It means that if you have a 600 square meter site, and just for reference, that's about 6,500 square feet. If you divide 600 by 75, you get 8. That's the number of dwellings you can have on this site. 15 by 40 site, 8 dwellings. If you have a 15 by 30 site, 450 square meters, divide that by 75, you get 6. And if it's 300 square meters, you could have 4. The next regulation is 4.1.6, which is this new regulation for maximum height of 10.5 meters. So I've shown 3 different homes here. The one on the far right was built under the Mature Neighborhood Overlay. That's what MNO stands for. And the height under that zone was 8.9 meters. The height under the new RS zone is 10.5, and that is measured to the midpoint of the slope. It's not the highest point on the roof, it's the midpoint of the slope. So this is actually kind of a 2.5 story. They probably have a higher ceiling on the main floor, maybe 10 feet. So I wanted to point out throughout the presentation, I'm going to be pointing out a few of the key priorities of IDEA, the Infill Development Edmonton Association. So they have proposed some priorities to the city. This was in June 20th of 2023, before the zoning bylaw was approved. And they were advocating to increase height to 12 meters. The next regulation is 4.1.7, which is the maximum site coverage, and that is 45% total site coverage. So, for example, in this one here, the site coverage of the principal dwelling and the rear backyard housing building would add up to 45% total site coverage. And so there's a bunch of different ways that you can configure the buildings, and all of these would add up to 45% site coverage. But what's new is putting all of the site coverage into one building, because it makes the building really long. Regulation 4.2 adds 2% site coverage, so that a total of 47%, where certain criteria apply. So for example, if you add an unenclosed porch, you can increase your site coverage up to 47%. So is the site coverage of this mid-block row housing, this is a big pie-shaped lot, this is in Park Allen, is the site coverage of this mid-block row housing compatible with surrounding development and land use? So on the right here you have a mature development, semi-bungalow, about 100 square meters in size. The site is actually 1,025 square meters for each one of these pie-shaped lots, roughly, close to that. I've measured this with Google Earth Pro. So this has about 9.8% site coverage. The house on the left here is a relatively new infill home built in 2005-4. It is 160 square meters for 15.6% site coverage of the principal dwelling. But for this infill, it's 2.5 times the size of this infill home on the left, and about 3.5 times this mature development on the right. It has about 350 square meters for this principal 4-dwelling row house. You can see the dwellings here, and their secondary suites. What you don't see is the garage, which adds another about 10%. So this would be about 45%. And it is massive. It's a huge building. So I looked up compatible land use, and I got this definitions from the city of Oklahoma. So incompatible land use, it is when the proposed use deviates significantly in density, intensity, scale, form, or activity, causing negative impacts on or being negatively impacted by surrounding land uses. Projects should not be supported unless extraordinary measures can be taken to offset the impacts. So the next regulation is 4.1.8, the maximum length of any building, and it's 30 meters, or 97.5 feet. And this allows the site coverage to be applied to a single building. So in this case, we're looking at the length of the building in the depth of the lot. But it could also be on consolidated lots, the length of the front facade of the building or the side of the building facing the flanking street. So that is also how you would use this 30-meter maximum building length. So in this case, this mid-block row housing is about 24.5 meters long. This mid-block apartment housing, which is in Grosvenor, I modeled this, and it is, if they've maximized their possible site coverage, they've maximized the 30-meter maximum building length. This corner row housing, I don't know how long this is, but it's facing, like it's on a corner site, so facing the flanking side street, but also the front street. And so that's how you would use the maximum building length. Setbacks. So section 4.3 outlines a bunch of different setbacks. And setbacks just mean the distance between the property line, which is this blue dotted line, all the way around or in between the buildings, and the building. So, this is an interior side setback. This is a minimum flanking side setback where the entrance to the dwelling faces the lane. This is the side setback of the building to the street where there's not an entrance. So there's all these different regulations regarding setbacks. So one of the key ones is that this minimum front setback has been reduced to 4.5 meters everywhere in the redeveloping area. Now, in mature areas, it was typical for the front setback to be 8 to 10 meters. And under the mature neighborhood overlay, that was reduced to 20% of lot depth. But now we're at 4.5, so we're less than half of what some of the mature developments surrounding infill their setbacks. So it causes the buildings to come a lot farther forward on the lot. Another major change is this minimum rear setback. So that's shown by this dotted line here. It's now 10 meters. It was 40% of lot depth, which would be about here. So on a 40-meter deep lot, that would be about 16 meters. So here's a couple of recommendations that RIWG is making. The first is to reduce the maximum building length to 20 meters, and the second is to increase the minimum rear setback to 35% of lot depth. So I've shown this on the far right. This number one is the 20-meter maximum building length, and this is mature development on the right. This is a recently built infill, built under the M&O, so this will be semi-detached. So this shows where these buildings are on the site, and they both can fit within they're not longer than 20 meters. This is single detached skinny homes, so this lot's been subdivided, and they barely make the 20-meter maximum building length. And one of the things I want to point out about semi-detached homes is it's a bit of an inefficient use of land because it's wasting 2.4 meters between the buildings that could essentially be applied if it was semi-detached. The rear of these buildings would be about a little bit more than 2 meters less long. So it would reduce the length of the buildings by that much. This is a triplex with secondary suites in the basement and 2 backyard housing. This works for within the 20 meters. So does this 4-square front and back oriented row housing. So I've shown here the entrances, the main and secondary entrances are at the front or the rear, and this also fits within this 20-meter length if there's a garage. And so some of the site coverage will be taken up by the garage. But all of these developments, the 3 on the left, they extend beyond the 20-meter length, and they don't comply with 35% lot depth. The most problematic is this one here, mid-block row housing. Because we're not seeing that much of this, but we're definitely seeing more mid-block row housing with side entries. So each of these little orange things are entries, and would be 4 main ones on one side and 4 secondary ones on the other. And so each one of these entrances have impacts to the adjacent development. Uh, the building is also really long, so it increases shadowing and massing impacts. It totally disrupts the flow of air movement typically between buildings. And if this is whichever side is facing the sun, it's also allowing a lot of heat buildup along the building development wall. But what maybe is acceptable, what people might accept, would be if all of the entrances are facing the front or flanking street or the rear, and so they're not impacting the neighbors. So this is sort of, the least impactful of row housing. Design regulations, section 5. What is working? Well, what might be working is when all of the entrances are facing a main or flanking street. So this particular development is row housing, and it would add 8 units. All of the entrances facing front flanking street. It has some architectural interest. Each one of the units is defined. There's quite a bit of windows and articulation to provide interest, and there's eyes on the street. So all of those things are positive. This is semi-detached with backyard housing. This is in Park Allen. This building it's semi-detached, so it's got 2 dwellings on either side. They're both 4 bedrooms because it's got 2.5 stories, almost 3. It's got 2 secondary units and 2 backyard housing units. So the height's 10.5 meters, allows moderate interior 8 to 9 foot ceilings. And it is compatible with surrounding development pattern of detached front and rear buildings. I'm going to show you why. So if you look at the rear of this building, it aligns with the other dwellings that I showed you in the previous picture. I showed you a previous picture of height, and it showed all of these buildings. But here's the rear of them. And this is the M&O infill on the left, and there's a mature just bungalow, single-story bungalow. And then you've got this building. So granted, this building is very large, and some people might not like the look of this building. But in terms of impacts, while this building will shadow these buildings at certain points of the day, there will still be sun access in the morning and in the afternoon. Late morning, probably there won't be. In early afternoon, maybe in the wintertime, but otherwise, there will be sun access. There's also a lot of area in the rear yard for larger trees and amenity space. It doesn't disrupt the airflow that's necessary for window cooling of adjacent mature homes. And so it can achieve the minimum 30% soft landscaping area, which we're going to get to in a bit. So that for those reasons, this is probably not that impactful. Cluster housing. So this is cluster housing consolidated at the end of the blocks. As I said earlier, this adds about 12 dwellings. So what's not working? Well, what's not working is mid-block 4-unit side entry row housing with up to 8 dwellings. I mean, it adds density, but it's incompatible with surrounding mature development patterns. It does not meet the 30% soft landscaping area, and the entries are not all the entries are oriented to the street. So this shows that 4 of the dwellings have side entries oriented to the neighbor's yard. This is mid-block. And on the other side, there are another 4 entries that are oriented to secondary dwellings that are oriented to the other neighbor. There really isn't a lot of amenity space, and I'm going to show you why. Because in the back, it's all parking. So, there's very little amenity area for people to share when we have the next pandemic and we have to visit outside. So in this case, I measured the site. It has only 12% soft landscaping area. The minimum is 30. This is mid-block 6-unit apartment. This is in Grosvenor. This adds 6 dwellings. It very likely meets the 30-meter maximum. Here's the 20 meters right here, which would align more or less with the neighboring homes. So all of the site coverage is applied to one building, and there'll very likely be all parking back here. But No room on the site that will be left for trees. This is RS zone side integral housing on a big pie-shaped lot, and I showed this. I've shown this development earlier in my presentation. This is in Park Allen, and we're going to take a look at some of the issues around this one. So it adds 8 dwellings, checks the box for density, but it is built to 4.5 meter front setback. And if you take a line and you go along the front facade of this, it aligns with the front door of this adjacent, relatively new infill home. It also has all of these units are facing the side of this building. And what that does is it increases nuisance impacts. So this is also a section of the bylaw. Nuisance impacts include impacts from lighting, noise, loss of privacy, that kind of thing. So dramatically increase the impacts from that. On the other side of this dwelling, you have 4 very small windows and 4 doors, 2 little porch overhangs, and two colors of siding. And so this is a 24.5 meter development all facing a mature development. It removed all of the trees from the site, and now, you know, this is going to heat up during the day and radiate heat. It blocks the airflow that's necessary for window venting of the adjacent development. It lacks architectural interest. It has very small windows, no articulation of the wall. They do allow articulation of the wall after 30 meters. It has to be articulated, but otherwise, yeah, it's a pretty blank, boring wall. So we're making 2 recommendations to address some of these things. Number 1, or number 3 actually, a minimum 40% front facade must have architectural features. So in the design regulation, they refer to design features and architectural features, but they aren't defined in the zoning bylaw. So what does that mean? And there isn't a percentage, it's just apply, I think it is 2 design features. And design features can be interpreted as different colors of siding or different orientation of the siding. It really is not robust. And so if you're looking at these, you see quite a bit of windows and articulation of the walls, articulation of the roof. You see some nice design features up in the gable end here, and some porches and railings, and you know, it just has some interest. And each of these units has a friendly connection to the street and eyes on the street. So that's what we're looking for. Recommendation number 4 is that all of the entrances, all the main entrances, must face a front or flanking street and not the side yard. And so what needs to be done is they need to eliminate Regulation 5.4.1, which provides an exception for this rule for cluster housing and multi-unit housing. So we want all of the entrances to be facing a front or flanking street and not the side yard. So now we're going to talk about landscaping regulations. The city did approve, after the zoning bylaw, there was a subsequent motion regarding climate and landscaping, and they have developed a climate resilience planning and development action plan with 15 actions, and one of them is resilient landscaping. So we're going to talk a little bit about how that should be achieved. So the first thing I want to show you, again, this is this Park Allen site, and this is what it looked like pre-development. So it had 50% of the site of a 1,025 square meter site was covered with tree canopy. 80% was covered with vegetation cover. There was an enormous 90 square meter canopy elm here, and we advocated super strongly to try to keep this elm. We also initially had them agree to keep a pine here and 3 small evergreens over here. But of all of the trees that were preserved, they weren't protected, and there aren't any requirements to provide fencing around trees during construction, private trees. So they were surrounded with, you know, 1 to 2 meters of fill, and they were damaged by construction equipment, and they've all since died. So this is that beautiful elm was cut down. It's very sad. So this is the developer proposed landscaping plan. There are going to be 10 trees, and in fact, there only needs to be 4. There only needs to be 1 tree per principal dwelling. And so there's only 4 principal dwellings, there really only needs to be 4. He's going to add 10, which is great, but each one of these trees are very small. They're columnar, they're ornamental, they're very, very small trees. So here's what happens. First of all, they've removed most of the soil from the site, especially where they were building the building. And in this area, the soil ranges anywhere from 2 to 3 feet deep. So then they only have to put back 100 millimeters of soil. That's 4 inches. So if you go from 1 meter deep soil to 100 millimeters of soil, that's a 90% net loss of soil. If you add only 5% of the trees, where there was 50% of the site covered by trees, there's a 90% net loss of tree canopy. And this has enormous impacts on climate resilience and the urban heat island effect. So here's just an illustration. It could be done in a number of different ways, but here's just one option of how you could add 20% mature canopy to this site by planting larger trees. So our recommendation is to develop a new minimum tree and shrub requirement to provide future mature canopy to 20% of the site and 1 shrub per 50 square meters. So I want to just point out this little red box here. The new table 3.1 of the minimum tree and shrub requirements actually reduced the number of trees by 50 to 75% and shrubs by 25 to 50% compared to the requirements in the previous zoning bylaw. So recommendation number 6 really has to do with site regulations. And the new zoning bylaw introduced a new minimum 30% soft landscaping area. This replaced a previous regulation in the earlier zoning bylaw of a 70% maximum imperviousness. So we would like to see this minimum 30% soft landscaping area move from the landscaping regulations to the RS zone site regulations in section 4.1, where it belongs and can be considered in the design of the site and the building. If it's not moved there, then the design and the site of the building have no consideration for this 30% soft landscaping area. And I'm going to get to it in a minute, but there is very poor compliance with landscaping regulations. So what this shows, a bunch of pie-shaped charts. We've gone from a 1 to 2 ratio of imperviousness, buildings and driveways and sidewalks, etc., to 2 parts soft landscaping area under mature development. That was flipped on its head under the MNO to a 2 to 1 imperviousness to soft landscaping area. And then the RS zone diminishes it even further. Now we've got 30%, so a little bit more than a 3 to 1 ratio of imperviousness to soft landscaping area. And it's even less if it's row housing or cluster housing or some of these, depending on the configuration of sidewalks and driveways and things. So anyways, you've got a diminishing soft landscaping area and an increasing development imperviousness. So what this means is that there's less and less room for trees. And that impacts climate resilience considerably. It also impacts the heat island effect, the urban heat island effect. Recommendation number 7 is to require permits for removal of mature trees, a private tree protection bylaw. And recommendation number 8 is to require protective fencing around preserved trees during construction so that they survive. And the final recommendation to landscaping regulations is recommendation number 9. And what we're recommending is that the city require a landscape security at the time of the development permit application for all small-scale residential infill and new development to incentivize compliance. Currently, the small-scale RS zone for infill and the small-scale RSF flex zone for new developing areas require no landscaping security. And consequently, compliance in a 2023 city survey of small-scale residential infill sites found only 11% compliance. And a study done in Queen Alexandra found of infill homes built between 2018 and 2021, only 39% had any trees planted. So, you know, there's room for improvement there. So why is landscaping important? Well, the U of A's Dr. Agrawal released a report in 2023 with Lofty and Welagadera, two other researchers, and they found that Edmonton has lost 15% of vegetation cover over the past 2 decades, and the urban heat island effect has dramatically increased. So, in 1999, this is what the city looked like. These are all done through LiDAR surveys. You can see that between 1999 and 2010, there was very little change. I mean, there's a little bit of orange and yellow here, not a lot, but those would be the heat island effect. But by 2015, we're starting to see a lot more orange. Now we've got more of the land surface temperature of 34 to 36 degrees, some increase to 36 to 40. And then by 2020, we've got more red showing up, over 40 degrees. And 2021, it's just a fire alarm. And the urban heat island effect, in 1999, the urban heat island effect is the difference between the rural temperature and the urban temperature. It was 1 to 2 degrees in 1999. By 2021, it was between 8 and 12 degrees difference. So that's significant. And if we want to be climate resilient, if we want to increase our private tree canopy, the city has a goal to increase it to 20% by 2071. And just for reference, Toronto's goal is to increase their tree canopy to 40% by 2050. So if we want to do that, we have to start thinking about how are we going to preserve and protect or replant some of the trees on private land related to infill redevelopment. So recommendation number 10 is really not related to the zoning bylaw 1-year review. It will come in 2026 when the city does a review of district policy and district plans. And there were some subsequent motions after the district policy plans were approved in October 2024. And it includes a review of how district policy 2.5.2.6 applies. So just to make this simple, what this policy essentially does is it supports upzoning property within neighborhoods to provide additional scale of development where at least 2 of this listed criteria A to E apply. So if you're within a node of corridor, within 100 meters of a node of corridor area, if you're within 400 meters of a mass transit station, if you're on an arterial or collector roadway, if you're at a corner site or adjacent to a park or open space, and finally, if you're adjacent to a site zoned for greater development than small scale, so if you're, say, next to an apartment building, if any 2 of those criteria apply, then the lot next to you could be supported for upzoning from RS to RSM, which is the small to medium scale transition zone, or medium scale, or even large scale residential development. Here's how that looks. So this is just showing what rezoning from RS to RSM would do. The RSM is the transition zone. So it would increase height from 10.5 to 12. It would increase site coverage to 60%. It would reduce the minimum front setback from 4.5 to 3. It would reduce the minimum rear setback from 10 to 5.5, and it would eliminate the maximum number of dwellings from 8 mid-block to none. And so there is supposed to also be a report on June the 3rd around incentivizing multi-unit dwelling housing, an analysis and consideration for small-scale residential zones to increase development intensity, could increase development intensity. So I think if you remember back, I was showing you some of the key priorities for IDEA, and essentially they want 12-meter height. They're asking for 55% site coverage. They're asking for reduced rear setback and essentially attaching rear garages, and they're asking for no maximum number of dwellings. So they want all of these things. That would change the game considerably. So I love this quote by Margaret Mead. Never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, it's the only thing that ever has. And finally, on June 3rd, there's a one-year zoning bylaw review. You can go to the city council meeting calendar. You just go Google City of Edmonton, and then you Google City Council meeting calendar, and you can, they're going to post the reports and attachments on May 22nd. You can check the agenda. You can read those reports. They're all linked to. You can register to speak online or in person there's at the very bottom of the page of the City Council meeting page. There's a link to register. You need to know the item number. That's why you have to look at the agenda. You can also contact the city clerk and they can help you with that. And you can make a 5-minute presentation online or in person. You can write to council. You can recommend our recommendations. You can recommend your own recommendations. Or you can write your own council or call your councilor and talk to them. And there's also, on the zoning bylaw, so if you Google zoning bylaw 20001, on the right-hand side, there's zoning map, then there's the zoning regulations, and on the right-hand side, there's zoning feedback, and there's this form. And you can click on it, and you can provide your input on this form. And that's it. Thank you very much for attending this session. I hope that you found it informative. If you have any questions, you can contact the Residential Infill Working Group by emailing riwg.edmonton@gmail.com.